At 82 years old, Charles Whitman thought he had seen enough winters to know what to expect, but nothing prepared him for the sting of hearing his only daughter, Karen Whitman, say the words that would cut deeper than any snowstorm. When Charles called to ask if he could join her family for Christmas, Karen's voice was warm at first, till it wasn't. "Dad, it's a family-only thing this year. Family only." The phrase echoed in his mind long after the call ended. After decades of sacrifice paying off Karen and her husband Mark's mortgage when they nearly lost their home, funding Mark's MBA so he could climb the corporate ladder, even moving across state lines to help raise their daughter Lily Charles, was suddenly no longer considered family enough for the holidays. He sat in his small Ohio apartment, the glow of his late wife Margaret's photo staring back at him, and asked himself the question no parent ever wants to face: when did I stop being a father and become just an obligation? Outside, neighbors decorated their front yards with glowing reindeer and strings of lights, laughter spilling out of houses full of warmth. Inside, Charles felt the chill of rejection sink deeper than the December cold. He had given everything: money, time. Loven now found himself cut off from the very people he had built his life around. But what Karen didn't know was that this rejection would spark something inside her father, something sharp, steady, and impossible to stop. Charles Whitman leaned back in his recliner, staring at the silent phone as if it had betrayed him just as much as his daughter. The words "family only" kept circling his thoughts, each repetition cutting a little deeper. He tried to remind himself of everything he had done over the years, every sacrifice, every dollar spent, every moment of his time given freely. Without question, it wasn't just money. It was love, commitment, and a father's duty. But when he looked at where he stood now, alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment, while Karen and her husband, Mark, enjoyed the comfort of a house he had helped buy, Charles couldn't help but to feel erased from his own story. He remembered the winter of 2008, and Karen and Mark were on the brink of losing their first home during the financial crisis. Their voices had been panicked when they called him, Mark ashamed to admit they were 3 months behind on their mortgage. Charles didn't hesitate. He wrote the check that saved the house. "Dad will never forget this," Karen had said. Through tears, and for a while, he believed her. Then came Mark's ambition. An MBA was the ticket to a better job, he'd said. But night classes drained him, and the bills were stacking up. One evening over dinner, Charles saw the exhaustion in his son-in-law's eyes. He had quietly pushed a folded check across the table: $60,000, enough for tuition. In 2 years of living expenses, he called it an investment in their future. Mark had clasped his hand, thanking him over and over. The gratitude, however, had a short shelf life. Mark got the degree. He landed the job. The family upgraded to a larger home in suburban Chicago, complete with a brand new SUV in the driveway and furniture that Charles had also helped pay for. For a while, it seemed like all was well. They hosted Thanksgiving dinners, invited him to birthdays, and called often. Charles had felt needed, like he was part of the engine that kept the family moving forward. But slowly, the tone changed. The phone calls became shorter, the visits less frequent. His role in their lives shifted from hero to helper, from helper to background figure. When Lily was in grade school, Charles had been their savior again. Karen's real estate business required early mornings, and Mark left for work before dawn. Someone had to drive Lily to school every day. Charles stepped up. At 6:30 every morning for 3 straight years, he showed up at their doorstep. He made his granddaughter scrambled eggs, packed her lunch, and drove her the 15 minutes to school. "You're a lifesaver," Karen would say, rushing past him with her coffee. "I don't know what we'd do without you." But one morning, without warning, she didn't need him anymore. Mark's job was stable, Karen's business was booming, and suddenly Charles was no longer part of the daily routine. There was no thank you dinner, no acknowledgement of his years of devotion, just a casual, "We've got it covered now." That's when Sunday dinners started thinning out. Once a week turned into once a month, then only on holidays, until, finally, even Christmas, the one day he thought was sacred, was closed to him. Charles sat with these memories, each one a reminder that his sacrifices had been quietly folded into the background of their success. His financial gifts had become entitlements. His help had become expected. And his presence, once cherished, had become optional. What stung most wasn't the money. He had worked his whole career in corporate finance. Money was simply numbers on paper to him. What hurt was how invisible he had become. The man who had lifted his family through every storm was now seen as nothing more than a burden. He reached for the photo on his side table, his late wife, Margaret, smiling beside him on their 40th anniversary. He remembered her words, whispered in the kitchen years ago when Karen had first asked for help with the house. "Be careful, Charlie. Giving too much can sometimes make people forget the value of what they've received." At the time, he had brushed it off. Margaret was always the cautious one, always reading between the lines. He had just wanted to give, to support, to make life easier for his daughter and her family. But now, alone in the quiet of his apartment, Charles realized Margaret had been right. His daughter had not only forgotten the sacrifices, she had rewritten the story in her mind. In her world, the house wasn't a gift from her father. It was simply their house, their success. The daily rides to school weren't a grandfather's devotion. They were just convenient childcare. And now, his desire to spend Christmas with them wasn't the wish of a father longing for a connection. It was an inconvenience. An intrusion. Charles folded his hands together, the weight of truth pressing down on him. For years, he had believed that giving would guarantee love, that sacrifice would secure loyalty. But on that December night, he realized something he should have known all along. Love that must be purchased isn't love at all. And perhaps, just perhaps, being excluded from Christmas wasn't the end of the story. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. Something his daughter would never see coming. It was a small envelope that changed everything. A Christmas card, sent from his old neighbor back in Indiana. Charles Whitman slid it open with his thumb, expecting a cheery holiday greeting and maybe a family update. Instead, he found words that froze him in place. "We were so excited to hear about Karen's new lake cabin in Michigan. She mentioned it was a gift from her father. How generous of you. You must be so proud." Charles read the line 3 times, his hand trembling. A gift? A lake cabin? He hadn't given his daughter a lake cabin nor any property for that matter. He hadn't even been asked, yet here it was, written in neat cursive. The kind of detail that couldn't be mistaken. A cold realization crept into his chest. Something was terribly wrong. Charles shuffled to his desk and powered up the old laptop. The screen flickered to life, its glow filling the quiet apartment. His fingers, stiff with arthritis, tapped the keys clumsily but deliberately. He logged into the county property records for northern Michigan. If there was a lake cabin, he was going to find it. The search took time, but finally the record appeared on the screen. A cabin on Bear Lake, purchased just 3 months earlier. The listed owner, the Whitman Family Trust. Charles blinked hard. He had never set up a family trust. He had no such legal entity. His heart pounded as the pieces began to click together. Weeks ago, Karen had sent over some papers, telling him they were routine financial planning documents. He hadn't. Read them carefully. He had trusted her. She was his daughter. Now he realized he had signed away something far bigger than routine paperwork. He had given her the keys to his kingdom. Charles leaned back in his chair, the truth crashing over him in waves. Karen had used his signature to create a trust he didn't authorize, and then used that trust to buy a vacation home pretending. It was his gift. In one stroke, she had stolen his money and his dignity. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. This wasn't about dollars and cents. This was about trust, the fragile bond between a father and daughter, now shattered. He rubbed his temples, remembering every check he had written, every favor he had given, paying off the mortgage, funding the MBA, helping with furniture, cars, daily school runs. Had it all been preparation for this? Had his daughter seen him not as a father but as a resource, a wallet that never closed? The phone sat on his desk, mocking him with its silence. For a moment, he considered calling Karen directly, demanding an explanation. But something inside him hesitated. He knew her tone too well, smooth, professional, dismissive. She'd talk to him as if he were a client with unrealistic expectations. not a father who had just been robbed. Instead, he picked up the documents she had sent weeks earlier. He spread them across the desk under the lamplight. At first glance, they looked harmless. Financial planning, estate adjustments, things an elderly man might reasonably sign. But as he read more closely, the truth became unmistakable. One document was a sweeping power of attorney granting Karen full authority over his accounts, properties, and investments. Another authorized the transfer of underutilized assets into a family trust she controlled. Buried in the fine print, a clause even allowed her to make healthcare decisions on his behalf. Charles' stomach churned. She had set the stage to take everything: his freedom, his future, even the right to decide where he lived. For the first time, Charles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. His own daughter had positioned herself to erase him from his own life. The irony was bitter. Karen had told him Christmas was family only. Now, reading these documents, he understood the cruel truth. In her mind, he wasn't family anymore. He was an asset to be managed, a complication. To be removed, Charles pushed the papers aside and closed his eyes. Memories of Margaret flooded in her warnings, her wisdom, her steady belief in protecting what they had built together. Charlie, she had once said, don't ever give away control, not of your home, not of your future. He hadn't listened then, but now he would. When he opened his eyes again, the despair had hardened into something else: resolve. He reached for his phone, not to call Karen, but to scroll further down his contacts list. His fingers stopped at a name he hadn't dialed in years: David Hollister, attorney at law. Charles tapped the number. The line rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered, steady and professional. David, it's Charles Whitman. I need your help. It's urgent. At that moment, Charles knew the fight for his dignity, and his future had begun. Charles Whitman had barely slept in the days following his discovery. The fraudulent papers sat in a neat stack on his desk, each one a knife wound delivered by the very daughter he had trusted most. His mind kept replaying the moment he saw the words Whitman Family Trust attached to that Michigan Lake cabin, a trust he had never created. A property bought with money he hadn't agreed to spend. He was still grappling with the enormity of it when his phone buzzed late one Wednesday night. The screen lit up with a name he hadn't seen before. It's just a single letter. L. His heart skipped. It was his granddaughter, Lily. She had programmed his number that way 2 years earlier, laughing about how it made her sound like a spy in a secret mission. Since then, though, every call had been filtered through Karen. She had controlled the schedule. Determined when or if Charles could speak to Lily, for Lily to text him directly. And at this hour could only mean one thing. Something was wrong. Grandpa, can I call you? Please don't tell Mom. Charles adjusted his glasses, squinting to be sure he'd read it correctly. His hands trembled as he typed back. Of course, sweetheart. Call any time. The phone rang within seconds. He pressed it to his ear, bracing himself. Grandpa?
Ow!
Lily's voice was hushed, almost a whisper. Charles pictured her huddled in her bedroom in Chicago, a towel shoved under the door to muffle sound. The way kids did when they didn't want parents to know. You're never a bother, honey, Charles reassured her gently.
What's the
matter? There was a pause. He could hear the hesitation, the way a 15-year-old weighs how much truth to share with an adult. Finally, Lily spoke. I heard Mom and Dad talking tonight about your stuff. My stuff. Charles asked carefully. Yeah, Mom was on the phone with someone about clearing out your assets. She said something about you not needing much at your age, and Dad told her to keep her voice down. Charles felt the familiar tightening in his chest, but his voice remained calm. What else did you hear, sweetheart? Lily took a shaky breath. She mentioned the lake cabin and something about a condo in Florida. She said they needed to sell before you. Complicated things. Words stung, but Charles forced himself to stay steady. Did she say anything about power of attorney? Yes, Lily whispered. She said you'd already signed papers, and that meant she could handle everything now. Grandpa, are you sick? Is that why they won't let you come for Christmas? Her concern nearly undid him. Here was the one person in his family not blinded by greed. A 15-year-old child worried not about inheritance, but about his health. No, sweetheart, he said softly. I'm not sick. I'm still me. But you're right, your parents have been making some choices without telling me. That's not okay. He could hear the anger rise in her voice. They didn't even let me call you on your birthday. Mom said you were probably busy, but I knew that wasn't true.
Oh.
Charles swallowed hard. His last birthday had been spent alone, watching Jeopardy! Reruns with Chinese takeout. Karen's card had arrived days late, signed only with her name. No note inside, Grandpa Lily continued, her voice firmer now. I don't care what Mom says. You're my family. You're the only one who ever really listens to me. You came to my science fairs. You taught me chess. You actually look at my photography instead of pretending. Please don't let them. Don't let them make you disappear. Her plea hit Charles like a thunderclap. Disappear. That was exactly what Karen and Mark had in mind. Strip him of authority, tuck him away in a facility, erase his presence from Lily's life until the money was gone. He closed his eyes and steadied his breathing. This wasn't just about protecting his assets anymore. It was about protecting Lily, the only person left who still saw him as more than a bank account. Lily, said, his voice low but certain, I need you to trust me. Things might get complicated over the next few weeks. Your parents may be upset with me. Everything I do, I'll be doing to keep us safe and to make sure you're taken care of. Can you keep this between us for now? Yes, she said instantly, without hesitation. I trust you more than anyone. Those words were both a comfort and a burden. Comfort because they reminded Charles that he still mattered. Burden because it meant the responsibility was now his to carry. After they hung up, Charles sat in the dark for a long while. The betrayal no longer felt abstracted, had a face, a consequence, and a ticking clock. His daughter was plotting to erase him, but his granddaughter had given him something even stronger than fear. She had given him purpose. For the first time since Christmas was taken from him, Charles felt steady. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was no longer just an old man sitting alone in a recliner. He was a grandfather with something to protect, and he wasn't going down quietly. When Charles Whitman hung up the phone that night, the silence in his apartment felt different. For weeks it had been a silence of defeat, the kind that sinks into a man's bones when he realizes his own child is plotting against him. But now it was a silence of resolve. Lily's whispered words still echoed in his head. Don't let them make you disappear. He leaned back in his worn recliner, staring at the ceiling. Disappear. That was the plan. Karen and Mark had already drawn up fake documents, already claimed power of attorney, already begun circling his modest assets like vultures. They expected him to fold, to drift quietly into compliance. But they had underestimated one thing's Charles. Whitman wasn't done living. The next morning, he walked into the small community bank where he had kept his accounts for decades. The manager, a balding man named Paul Jenkins, had known Charles since the days he'd run the local hardware store. Paul greeted him with the warmth reserved for old friends. Charles, good to see you, Paul said, extending his hand. What brings you in? Charles looked him in the eye. I need to secure my accounts, Paul, and I need a private safety deposit box today. Paul frowned slightly. Everything all right? No, Charles admitted, but it will be. I just need to make sure some things are protected before my daughter gets. Any ideas? There was no judgment in Paul's eyes, only a quiet understanding. Within the hour, Charles had moved key documents, birth certificates, military records, insurance policies into the vault. I also added the one thing Karen didn't know about, a deed Margaret had left him years ago, tucked in her Bible. A small piece of land in Vermont. Nothing flashy, but it was his. Untouchable. Later that week, Charles met with attorney Samuel Green, a wiry man in his late 60s who had practiced law in town for decades. Samuel was known for two things, his sharp mind and his utter intolerance. For deception, Charles laid the forged trust documents on the table. They've been busy, Samuel muttered, flipping through them. Sloppy work, but dangerous. If they file these in the right place, they can make your life hell. No? What do I do? Charles asked. Samuel leaned back, steepling his fingers. First, we file a cease and desist. Then we prepare affidavits declaring these documents fraudulent. Most importantly, we set up a living trust in your name, your real one. That way you control who gets what and when. Not your daughter, not your soon-in-law. Charles felt something stir in him, an unfamiliar energy, part fear, part fire. And if they try to push, Samuel's eyes hardened. Then we push back harder. You've got rights, Charles. You're not incompetent. You're not gone. No judge worth his robe is going to strip a man like you of his independence without a fight. Those words lit a spark. For weeks, Charles had been drifting, reacting, 2 blows as they came. But now he was fighting back. That night he opened an old notebook and drew 3 columns, just as Samuel had advised. At the top he wrote, what they know, what they don't, what I want them to think. Under what they know, he listed the Ohio apartment, his checking account, his pension. Under what they don't, he scribbled down the Vermont deed, the safety deposit box, the backup savings account Margaret had quietly built years ago. Under what I want them to think, he paused, then smiled for the first time in weeks. He wrote that I'm tired, that I'm retreating, that I'm exactly who they think I am. Because the truth was, he wasn't retreating at all. He was preparing, before. Bed, he pulled out an old photo of Margaret, her smile steady and reassuring. You were right, he whispered to her memory. They did come for what we built, but I'm not going to let them win. Not now, not ever.
Outside.
The wind rattled against the windows, the December chill pressing in. But inside, Charles felt something he hadn't felt in years, a rising determination. He was no longer the man begging for a Christmas invitation. He was a man with a plan, a man with fire in his veins. And for the first time since Margaret's passing, Charles Whitman was ready to fight for his life, his dignity, and his legacy. And if Karen thought she could erase him with a few signatures, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The following morning, Charles Whitman woke with more clarity than he'd felt in months. The plan was no longer a vague thought swirling in the back of his mind. It was taking shape, sharp and deliberate. For the first time since Margaret's passing, he had direction. And that direction began with preparation. He drove across town to the post office, his old Chevy humming through the cold Ohio streets. He sighed. He filled out the paperwork for a P.O. box. To the clerk, it was just another transaction. But to Charles, it felt like reclaiming control. From now on, important mail would no longer pass through the same mailbox Karen and Mark had been casually rifling through on their visits. No, this was his, private and secure. When he returned home, he laid out the documents on his kitchen table. Margaret's handwriting still covered many of them, her neat cursive spelling out account numbers, property details, and insurance information. He handled each page with care as though she were there guiding him. Sat the official deed to the Vermont property. The small farmhouse had been in Margaret's family for decades, and he had nearly forgotten it existed until he'd stumbled on the papers. It's tucked away in her Bible. That farmhouse became the cornerstone of his escape. That afternoon, Charles called Anna Miller, an old family acquaintance who lived not far from the property. Anna had helped Margaret's parents manage the place years ago, and Charles trusted her. When Anna answered, her voice carried the warmth of familiarity. Charles Whitman, I haven't heard your voice in years, she said, surprised but delighted. Anna, Charles replied, steadying himself. I may need your help. Do you still look in on that old farmhouse from time to time? Of course, Anna said quickly. Still standing, though it could use some love. Why do you ask? Charles paused before answering, because I may need it sooner than later. I'd rather someone I trust keep an eye on things. Before I come up there was no hesitation. Say the word, Charles. I'll make sure it's ready. When he hung up, a weight lifted from his chest. He had an ally. He wasn't alone. The next step was communication. He dialed attorney Samuel Green, who had already been working tirelessly to protect Charles from the fraudulent documents. Together, they drafted a series of letters, essay and desists, addressed directly to Karen and Mark's lawyer. Samuel insisted they be firm but professional, a warning shot across the bow. This puts them on notice, Samuel explained. Blah 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 blah. They'll... No, you're not backing down. Charles also arranged for duplicate records to be sent to his new P.O. box, and encrypted copies stored with Samuel. No matter what tricks Karen and Mark pulled, they would not erase his paper trail. Still, Charles knew this wasn't just about defense. It was about creating options. He went online that evening and quietly purchased a fully refundable one-way plane ticket to Burlington, Vermont. The confirmation email landed safely in his P.O. box, invisible to anyone but him. It was a signal. To himself, if things turned ugly, he had a way out. At his kitchen table, Charles opened the notebook he'd started his 3-column battle plan. He expanded it, line by line, as though drawing a map for war. What they know, the Ohio apartment, the pension, the obvious accounts. What they don't, the Vermont deed, the safety deposit box, Anna's loyalty, Samuel's legal shield. Would I want them to think that he was weary, overwhelmed, maybe even slipping? It wasn't just strategy, it was survival. Each day, Charles added new tasks. Sorting belongings into 3 piles. Go, stay, travel. He packed a small suitcase with essentials, clothes, medications, Margaret's photo ready if he needed to leave in a hurry. He arranged for movers to return boxes of Karen and Mark's old things, a silent but deliberate gesture. I'm giving back what belongs to you. I'm keeping what belongs to me. Every step gave him strength. At night, Charles sat by the window with a mug of coffee, staring out at the frost clinging to the glass. For weeks he had felt like a burden, pushed aside by the very people he had raised. But now he felt the quiet thrill of a man reclaiming his agency. He wasn't just preparing to defend himself, he was preparing to live on his terms. The next move, he knew, would provoke Karen and Mark. They would not take kindly to his defiance. But that no longer frightened him, because Charles Whitman had something they didn't: patience, resolve. And a lifetime of experience they could never match. And while they schemed in the dark, he was building something stronger than schemes. He was building freedom. The knock on the door came on a gray Saturday morning. Charles Whitman already knew who it was before he even opened the door. He had been expecting this visit ever since the C.I. Sandusist letters went out. When he turned the handle, there they stood Karen, her husband Mark, and a sharp-looking man in a tailored suit carrying a leather briefcase. Dad. We need to talk, Karen said, her voice coated with forced patience. Charles stepped aside. Then come in, but keep it short. I have no time for nonsense. The 3 of them shuffled into the living room, their polished shoes sounding out of place against his old wooden floors. The lawyer introduced himself Richard Collins, a family estate specialist, as he put it, though Charles knew better. He was here to pressure, to intimidate, to make Charles feel small in his own home. Collins opened his briefcase and slid out a stack of papers. Mr. Whitman, I understand you've been reluctant to discuss your estate planning with your daughter and soon-in-law. My role is simply to guide everyone toward a fair resolution. Fair for whom? Charles asked, his voice calm but edged. Karen jumped in before the lawyer could answer. Dad, you're living here all alone. This house, your account sits too much for you. We're only trying to help. If you sold the property, you'd have more than enough to move into a nice retirement community. Mark and I have already spoken with a buyer. Charles raised his eyebrows. A buyer? Without my consent? Mark shifted uncomfortably, but pressed. It's a good offer. More than this place is worth. You'd be taken care of, and we could manage the rest for you. You shouldn't have to worry at your age. Charles leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and let silence fill the room. He watched them squirm, waiting for him to bend. Finally, he spoke. Let me be very clear. I am not selling this home. I am not moving into some retirement box. And I will not be managed like a child who doesn't know his own name. Karen's voice tightened. Dad, we're just worried. You're not thinking clearly. Mom would have wanted you safe. That struck a nerve, but Charles didn't let it show. Don't you dare use your mother's memory to justify greed. She knew me better than anyone, and she trusted me to live as I see fit. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Mr. Whitman, refusing to make decisions can leave your estate vulnerable. If something were to happen, the courts might have to step in. That's not an ideal outcome for anyone. Charles smiled coldly. I've already made my decisions, Mr. Collins, and my attorney, Samuel Green, is fully aware of your little visit here today. So unless you'd like to exchange paperwork between lawyers, I suggest you pack up your briefcase. Karen's face flushed with anger. So that's it? You're just going to dig in your heels? After everything we've done for you? Charles stood, his presence suddenly filling the room. Everything you've done for me? Karen, I raised. You. I worked double shifts so you could go to college. I paid your bills when you and Mark were drowning in debt. I kept this family together when your mother got sick. Don't stand in my house and tell me what you've done for me. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Mark finally muttered, "This isn't over, Charles." Moved to the door and opened it wide. You're right, it isn't. But the next move will not be yours. Good day. One by one, they filed out, the lawyer looking flustered, Karen fuming, and Mark avoiding his father-in-law's gaze. When the door shut, Charles exhaled slowly. His heart pounded, but his resolve was firm. He knew this was only the beginning of their campaign to wear him down. But today, for the first time, Charles felt the power shift. He wasn't the confused old man they thought they could manipulate. He was still the head of this family. He wasn't going anywhere. The silence in the house after Karen, Mark, and their lawyer left was almost comforting. Charles sat in his favorite armchair, letting the echoes of the confrontation fade. He knew they'd be back, angrier, more determined, and likely with new tricks up their sleeves. But for now, he had something they didn't: time, foresight, and Margaret's quiet wisdom guiding him even from the grave. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived from Peter Alvarez, the Lisbon attorney Margaret had trusted. Charles opened it carefully at the kitchen table, his hands steady. Inside were notarized documents confirming his sole ownership of the villa in Portugal. Margaret had left it all in his name, untouchable, out of reach of Karen and Mark. Alongside the legal papers was a letter from Alvarez, assuring him that protective filings were already in place. No one, not even his own children, could lay claim to what Margaret had set aside for him. Charles sat back, staring at the papers. Relief washed over him, but it was mixed with something else: resolve. Margaret had always known their children's weaknesses. She had prepared for this moment, leaving behind not only a home, but a plan. Charles realized it was now up to him to carry it out with precision. That night, he pulled out a yellow legal pad and drew 3 columns, just as he had once done when managing factory budgets decades earlier. What they know: the house in Ohio, his pension, his checking account. What they don't know: the villa, the bank accounts Margaret kept hidden, the letters and legal safeguards now in place. What I want them to think: that he was vulnerable, perhaps even willing to bend, just enough to keep them guessing. For the first time in weeks, Charles felt in control. The following morning, he began sorting through decades of belongings. He made 3 piles in the living room: go, stay, travel. Furniture and old keepsakes went into stay. Clothes and essentials for his next chapter were carefully folded into travel. And then there was the go pile, which grew larger by the hour. Boxes filled with Karen's childhood memorabilia, Mark's old tools, and Lily's forgotten toys. Each box was labeled neatly and stacked by the front door. By the end of the week, Charles had hired a local moving service. When the truck pulled up, he handed the driver instructions to deliver everything to Karen and Mark's home with one simple note attached: returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. The movers raised their eyebrows, but Charles said nothing more. This wasn't about revenge. It was about drawing a line. His house was no longer a storage unit for a family that saw him as disposable. It was his space, his sanctuary, and he intended to reclaim it fully. That evening, he poured himself a small glass of bourbon and sat by the fire. He imagined the look on Karen's face when those boxers arrived at her doorstep. Anger, confusion, perhaps even guilt, but none of it mattered. For once, Charles wasn't reacting to their schemes. He was setting the terms. Later, he tucked Margaret's documents into the blue folder she had once hidden away. Charles whispered into the quiet room. I'm doing it, Margaret, just like you wanted. They won't touch what's ours. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows, but inside Charles felt a warmth he hadn't known in months. He wasn't just holding on, he was preparing. Piece by piece, step by step, he was building the escape route his late wife had entrusted to him. And when the time came, he would be ready to walk it with his head held high. The phone calls started. Before sunrise, Charles ignored them. By mid-morning, he could see the storm building through his front window. Mark's SUV screeched into the driveway, gravel spitting under the tires. The engine cut and the door slammed hard enough to echo. Down the quiet Ohio street, Charles rose slowly from his chair, steady as a man walking into weather he'd been expecting all along. The pounding on the front door rattled the hinges. "Dad, open this door right now." Mark's voice carried the edge of entitlement Charles had heard his whole life, but today, it didn't pierce him. When Charles opened the door, Mark barged inside without waiting for permission. His face was red, his fists clenched. "What the hell was that?" shouted. "You sent boxes of junk to my house, like you're cutting us out, after everything we've done for you." Charles closed the door behind him and leaned lightly against it, calm as stone. "I sent you what belongs to you, Mark, that's all." Mark jabbed a finger toward him. "No, what you did was humiliate me in front of Karen and Lily. Do you know what my daughter said when she saw those boxes? She asked if Grandpa didn't love us anymore." His voice cracked, but not with sorrow, with rage. Charles let the silence stretch, then spoke evenly. "Love doesn't mean letting people use you, son. It means setting boundaries before resentment poisons everything. You and Karen don't want me in your life except when it's convenient? Fine, but this house, my life, my choices, they are not yours to manage." Mark's jaw tightened. "You're being selfish. You've got a house you can't handle, bills stacking up. And instead of letting us help, you push us away. You're acting like a stubborn old man who doesn't know what's best for himself." Insult rolled off Charles like rain off a roof. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "I paid off this house 6 years ago. Margaret and I built this home with sacrifice you'll never understand, and you call me selfish. No, Mark. What's selfish is pressuring me to sell so you and Karen can line your pockets." Mark flinched, but his pride wouldn't let him back. "Down, that's not fair," he muttered. "It's the truth," Charles replied. "You wanted control, not to help me. But hear me clearly, those days are over." For a moment, neither spoke. The tension in the room was thick, broken only by the sound of the old wall clock ticking. Finally, Mark's bravado faltered. He looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't seen before. Not weakness, not confusion, but resolve. "You've changed," Mark said bitterly. "No," Charles answered, shaking his head. "I've remembered who I am." Mark's fists unclenched, but his face hardened into a mask. Without another word, he turned, yanked the door open, and stormed back to his SUV. The engine roared. Tires screeched, and then the street was quiet. Again, Charles stood for a moment, the cool draft from the open door brushing against him. Then he gently closed it, turned the deadbolt, and exhaled. He didn't feel guilt. He didn't feel regret. What he felt was strength and anchor settling. Deep after months of drifting in grief and manipulation, in the solitude of the house. Charles whispered to Margaret's photo on the mantel. "They think I'm alone, but I'm not. You left me more than memories. You left me the wisdom to fight." He sat back down in his chair, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth. For the first time in years, Charles realized the power of saying no. And with every boundary he drew, he wasn't just defending himself. He was reclaiming the dignity his children had tried to strip away. The battle wasn't over. But tonight, Charles felt ready for whatever came next. The days after, Mark's stormy visit passed quietly, like the calm that follows a heavy rain. Charles tended to his routine's coffee at dawn. The newspaper folded neatly on the kitchen table, a walk through the neighborhood when the sun warmed the frost. But something was different now. The silence inside the house no longer felt empty. It felt steady, almost protective. The legal papers from Attorney Alvarez had arrived, stamped and signed, confirming what Charles already knew in his heart. The house was his alone, beyond dispute. And tucked away in his desk was the deed to the villa in Portugal, his secret sanctuary, waiting should he ever decide to leave. For the first time in years, he felt choice in his hands, not pressure. One afternoon, Charles sat at his dining room table with a stack of envelopes. He wasn't writing checks for his children's debts anymore, nor signing away control of his future. Instead, he was writing letters. One for Karen, one for Mark, and one especially for his granddaughter, Lily. The first two were short, firm, and honest. I love you, but I will not be managed. If you want me in your life, it will be on the basis of respect, not control. The letter to Lily was longer, full of stories about her grandmother Margaret, her laugh, her stubborn streak, her kindness. Charles wanted Lily to know the strength she came from, not just the chaos of her parents' ambition. He ended the letter with a promise. My door will always be open to you, not because I am obligated, but because I choose to love you freely. That evening, Charles lit the fireplace, poured himself a small glass of bourbon, and sat in his chair facing the mantel. Margaret's photo rested in its frame, watching over him as it always had.
He whispered softly, I finally did it, Maggie.
I stopped letting them take from me what we built together. A tear slid down his cheek, not of sorrow this time, but of relief. For the first time in decades, Charles wasn't living for anyone else's approval. He was living for himself, outside. Christmas lights twinkled on the houses lining the street. Families gathered around their tables, laughter spilling through windows. Charles didn't feel bitterness watching it anymore. He felt peace, because he knew true family isn't defined by blood or obligation. It's defined by respect, kindness, and love freely given. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether Karen or Mark would ever change, whether Lily would grow to understand his choices, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would never again surrender his dignity in the name of keeping peace. He had discovered that real peace comes from standing firm in who you are. Charles's story reminds us of something deeply important, especially as we grow older. Love is not measured by how much we give until we're empty. Real love has boundaries. Respect isn't optional, it's the foundation of any relationship worth keeping. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say to those who take you for granted is a simple, calm no. So if you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or treated like an afterthought, let Charles's story remind you, you are not a burden. Your worth doesn't depend on how much you sacrifice for others. Your dignity, your peace, and your happiness matter. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to draw a line with someone you love? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. And your voice matters here. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories of courage, dignity, and rediscovering strength later in life, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. That way you'll never miss the next chapter, because sometimes the right story at the right time can change everything.